10 True Winter Horror Stories. Story number 1. The Snowman's Eyes. The storm came without warning. One minute, the sky was a soft gray. The next, it was swallowed up by thick, swirling clouds that seemed to arrive out of nowhere. By the time the Davis family noticed, the first flakes had already begun to fall. Slowly at first, then faster, like a veil coming down over the world. For 2 days, the snow buried everything. The streets were impassable. The wind howled, and the town of Windham was locked in a bitter embrace with winter. People huddled inside their homes, the world outside a frosted blur of white and wind. The Davis family was no different. There was Ben, the father, who had come back from the grocery store with the last of the milk and bread, a rare victory in the face of the storm. Then there was Rachel, his wife, busy in the kitchen making soup and a batch of cookies to keep everyone warm. And, of course, there were the kids, Max and Lily. Max, 12, had a love for adventure that often put him at odds with the rules, and Lily, at 10, was a dreamer who found magic in the mundane. It had all started with a snowman. Max had begged his father to help him build it, and Ben, tired but happy to see his son so full of life, agreed. The two of them had spent a good part of the afternoon packing snow into a giant mound. Rachel, standing at the window with a cup of tea, had watched them from the warmth of the house, smiling as the storm began to gather strength. By the time they were done, the snowman stood tall in the front yard, a lopsided figure with a crooked carrot for a nose and 2 pieces of coal for eyes. His old top hat, pulled from the attic, was perched jauntily on its head. But that was yesterday. Now, as the snow fell heavier, as the winds grew angrier, the Davis family sat in the living room, listening to the storm rage outside. Ben had pulled out an old board game for Max and Lily, but their attention kept drifting to the window, to the yard where the snowman stood. It was the eyes that caught their attention first. At first, it was just a strange feeling, a nagging, unsettling thought that wouldn't leave Max's mind. He had kept an eye on the snowman all day, but now, as night fell and the wind howled, he could have sworn that the snowman's eyes weren't looking straight ahead anymore. They seemed different, like they were watching him. "Mom," Max called, his voice low. Rachel glanced over. "What is it?" "Something's weird about the snowman," Max said, his eyes narrowing as he stared out into the storm. Rachel furrowed her brow. "It's just snow, Max. It's probably the wind playing tricks." But Max wasn't so sure. He stared out the window again, and this time he saw it. The snowman's eyes, they were no longer just pieces of coal. They were moving, twisting, like they were following him. "Mom, look," Max said, pointing, his finger trembling. Rachel turned, but all she saw was the storm. The snowman stood in the yard, frozen and silent. The darkness had swallowed up everything else, leaving only the silhouette of the snowman and the swirling whiteness of the snowstorm. "I'm telling you, Mom, something's wrong." Rachel shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. "Max, you're imagining things. It's just the snow, the wind." But then it happened again. This time, Lily noticed it too. She gasped, her eyes wide with fear. "Mom, look!" The snowman moved. Rachel's heart skipped a beat, and she turned back to the window, her breath catching in her throat. The snowman's head was tilted slightly to the left now. His once straight body was bent, as if it had shifted slightly in the snow. Ben, hearing the tension in his children's voices, stepped into the room. "What's going on?" Max didn't need to say anything. He pointed. Ben's face tightened as he turned to look out the window. For a moment, the storm seemed to fall away, and he felt the air grow unnervingly still. The snowman was standing in the same spot, but something about him, Something about the way the shadows played over his form made Ben uneasy. "I think it's just the storm playing tricks on you," Ben said, his voice a little shakier than he intended. But the longer they watched, the more it felt like the snowman was alive, its coal eyes glistening like black pools in the dim light. The more they stared, the more they saw that its arms, once positioned in an awkward stiff pose, had moved, just slightly. By the time the clock struck midnight, the family was no longer sitting together in the living room. The storm had reached its peak, and they were too frightened to leave the windows, too scared to let their eyes drift from the figure outside. Then, something shifted in the snow. The snowman's top hat was gone, and in its place where his head had been, the snow had begun to form a twisted, gaping mouth. It stretched wide like it was hungry, and the eyes that had once been so lifeless, were now full of something dark, something that wasn't quite human. Max swallowed hard. It's not made of snow anymore," Lily screamed. The snowman's once frozen body began to twitch and groan, as if waking from a long slumber. The snow that made up its body was no longer soft and pure. It was thick and gelatinous, like something else entirely, something alive. The kids watched in horror as the snowman's mouth widened, stretching to an unnatural size, a low, guttural sound rising from within its belly. It wasn't a scream or a howl, but something far worse, a deep, ancient hunger. Ben stood frozen, staring in shock. "Get away from the window, now!" But it was too late. The snowman's eyes locked on them, no longer mere pieces of coal, but eyes that seemed to burn with an insatiable need. And then, as the winds howled louder than ever, it moved, slowly, relentlessly. The snowman shuffled forward, its massive, dark mouth opening wider as it closed in on the house. The Davis family could do nothing but watch, as the thing they had built the day before crept closer, ready to take them one by one. The snowstorm raged outside, but inside, the house was still and silent, save for the muffled screams that came from the yard. Story number 2. Echoes on the Wind. Lena had always dreamed of escaping the constant noise of the city, the honking cars, the sirens, the constant hum of life. It was exhausting. So when she stumbled upon a small cabin tucked away deep in the woods, it felt like a sign. The ad had promised peace, solitude, and a break from everything. It sounded perfect. She didn't think twice about packing up her things and leaving the bustle of New York behind. After all, the cabin was only a few hours away, and she was tired. The kind of tired you feel deep in your bones. The kind of tired that no amount of sleep or caffeine could fix. The cabin was exactly as she'd imagined. Small, isolated, and covered in a thick layer of snow, nestled between two towering pines. The windows were cracked, and the wood creaked with age, but it was charming. She could already see herself spending quiet evenings reading by the fire, surrounded by nothing but the stillness of the forest. But then the storm came. It wasn't supposed to be more than a light dusting, just enough to cover the ground and make everything look fresh. But by nightfall, it had turned into something far worse. Snow piled up in thick drifts against the windows, and the wind began to howl like an animal trapped in the trees. Lena, cozy inside with a mug of tea, pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to ignore the noise. The storm lasted for 2 days. When it finally passed, the world outside was a silent white wasteland. It was on the 3rd day that Lena first heard the voices. At first, she thought it was the wind. The howling gusts had a way of carrying strange sounds, twisting them into something else. But this time, the sound was clearer, like a group of children laughing. It wasn't loud at first, just faint, like it was coming from far off in the distance. Lena stood up from the chair where she'd been reading and went to the window, peering out into the snow-covered yard. Nothing. She shook her head. It was just the wind, but then the laughter came again. This time, it was closer. She stood frozen in place, her breath catching in her throat. It was unmistakable, a child's laugh followed by the sound of someone calling out to her. Come play with us." Lena blinked, wondering if the isolation was starting to get to her. She hadn't been around anyone for days. Maybe the silence was starting to make her imagine things. But the laughter came again, and this time it was followed by a voice that was even clearer. "Lena, we're waiting." Her heart skipped a beat. There was no one there. She backed away from the window and looked around the cabin, half expecting someone to be standing right behind her. But the room was empty. She could hear the wind still howling outside, but no voices, no laughter. Just the eerie silence. She told herself she was being ridiculous. The storm had messed with her mind, that's all. There was no one outside. But when the sun began to set, the voices returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. Children laughing and calling her name, whispering secrets she couldn't quite understand. The voices seemed to be coming from all directions at once, carried by the wind, seeping through the cracks in the walls. Lena couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to know what was happening. The next morning, she decided to investigate. She bundled up in layers, bracing herself against the cold, and stepped outside. The snow was pristine, untouched, as if the world had stopped moving. She walked toward the edge of the woods, where the voices had seemed to come from. As she trudged deeper into the trees, the air grew thick with an unnatural stillness. The wind had died down completely, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake, and then she found it. At the base of an ancient oak tree, half buried in the snow, was a weathered wooden sign. It was barely legible, the paint long faded, but the words were clear enough. The Children of Winter. Lena felt a chill run down her spine. She had never heard of anything like that. The Children of Winter? It sounded like a myth, some story parents told their kids to keep them inside during snowstorms. But the closer she looked, the more she realized that there was something about this place. Something wrong. She took a step back, and that's when she saw it. A shadow moving in the snow. A figure, small and hunched, darting between the trees. It was quick, too quick, like it wasn't really there. Lena's breath caught in her chest. She wanted to turn and run, but her feet wouldn't move. The figure stopped, and for a moment all was still. Then, in the distance, a chorus of laughter echoed through the woods, carried on the wind. "Lena, we're waiting." The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice from before, only now it was clearer, more desperate. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was no one there. That night, the wind came again, but this time it brought something else with it. Whispers, faint but clear, rising from the snow outside. "Lena, come play with us." Lena couldn't ignore it anymore. The voices were no longer just echoes of the storm. They were real, coming from the past, from something that had died long ago but still lingered in the wind. The next morning, she found the old cabin's history. The original owners had been a family, but during one particularly brutal winter, they had vanished without a trace. No one knew what happened to them, but locals whispered about strange children who would appear on the coldest nights, laughing in the distance. Some said the children had never left, that their spirits were bound to the woods, forever trapped in the snow. And now, it seemed, Lena had become part of their story. The voices were always there now, waiting for her, calling to her. She had heard their laughter, seen their shadowy figures, and now they were bound to her, just as they had been to the family before her. The wind carried their whispers and the snow would never let her forget. Lena never left the cabin. No one ever saw her again. The storm had claimed her, just as it had claimed the others before her. And every winter when the wind howls through the trees, you can hear the echoes of children laughing, waiting for the next person to come. Story number 3. The Last Train to Frost Hollow. It was supposed to be a quiet ride home, the kind of train journey that blends into the background of a typical winter evening. But the blizzard had hit harder than anyone expected. The kind of snow that doesn't just fall, it drifts, whips, and stings. The kind of snow that traps you in a world where nothing feels real. Martin Taylor had just finished a long day at the office and was looking forward to getting back to his small apartment. He stood on the cold platform, watching the snow swirl around in angry gusts, his breath coming out in clouds. The train finally pulled up. An old thing, dark blue with rust on the edges. It looked worn, tired, just like him. He climbed aboard, shaking the snow off his coat as the doors closed behind him. The train was nearly empty. Only a few people scattered in the dim light of the carriage. A man in a heavy coat sat across from him, his face hidden by the shadow of his hood. A woman with a baby in a pram was seated near the door. There was a middle-aged man by the window, tapping away at his phone, the glow of the screen lighting up his face. Martin took a seat by the window, glancing outside at the swirling snow, already thick enough to obscure the view. The train pulled away, the soft hum of the engine almost comforting against the storm. He let out a sigh and settled in. A few more stops and he'd be home. The journey was routine, just like any other evening. But as the minutes passed, something felt off. It started with a low murmur from the other passengers. At first, it was nothing, just whispers, like people trying to make small talk to pass the time. But the longer they rode, the more agitated the murmurs grew. The man across from Martin shifted in his seat, his eyes darting around the car. The woman with the baby kept looking nervously at the door, as though expecting someone, or something, to enter. The train slowed, the soft squeal of the wheels on the tracks echoing in the tense silence. Martin looked up at the sign by the door, the one that listed all the stops. They should have been coming up on his stop soon, but the sign didn't say anything about his stop. In fact, it was blank. He frowned. Maybe the storm was messing with the system. It wouldn't be the first time. But then the train didn't stop. It kept going. Martin glanced at the other passengers. They were all staring ahead now, their eyes wide, locked on the same spot. The tension was palpable, like everyone knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to say it out loud. The woman with the baby suddenly stood up, her hands trembling as she reached for the pram. Her voice broke the silence. "We need to get off. We need to stop." But the train didn't stop. The snow outside had turned from a soft flurry to a blinding white sheet. The wind howled against the windows, pushing the snow up against the glass. The temperature inside the train began to drop, and Martin could see his breath in the air. He stood up, his pulse quickening. "What's going on?" he asked aloud. No one answered. They just stared ahead, their faces pale, lips pressed tight. The train rattled over the tracks, the speed picking up. Martin could feel the unease settle over him like a weight. His heart pounded in his chest as the train continued down the tracks, farther and farther away from civilization. The woman with the baby was crying now, her sobs cutting through the air. "Please, we have to get off. We're not supposed to be on this train." Martin's eyes flicked to the man by the window, who was now staring out into the dark snowstorm. He looked pale, his face drawn and haggard, like he hadn't slept in days. His hand was trembling as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled map. "Where are we?" Martin asked him, his voice shaky. The man didn't respond. He just kept staring out the window, his eyes wide and vacant. Martin looked at the map the man had dropped on the seat, spreading it out. The place he was pointing to was Frost Hollow. He'd never heard of it before. The train screeched as it rounded a bend, the noise deafening. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. And then, just like that, the train slowed. It came to a stop, but not at any station. The doors slid open, and a cold draft swept through the car. The snow outside was blinding now, swirling in the air like smoke. There was something else, too. A figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the platform. The figure was tall, dressed in black, and its face was hidden by a hood. The passengers stood up as one, their faces pale, their bodies stiff. They moved as if in a trance, all heading toward the door. Martin felt his legs freeze in place. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. Something was drawing him toward that figure. As the last of the passengers filed out, Martin remained seated, his heart hammering in his chest. The temperature had dropped even further, and the air inside the train had become thick, almost suffocating. Then, as the last passenger left, the train lurched forward again, but the doors stayed open. Martin turned around. The train wasn't going anywhere. The figure outside was now at the door, standing just out of reach, its face still hidden beneath the hood. But it was smiling now. A low, hollow laugh echoed through the car, making Martin's skin crawl. He turned and looked out the window. The snow outside had stopped falling, but the world beyond the glass was wrong. The trees were bent at odd angles, their limbs twisted and gnarled. The landscape was empty, devoid of life. It was as if they were no longer in the world they had once known. The figure outside reached out its hand toward the door, and the train jerked forward, dragging Martin along with it. In that moment, he understood. He wasn't on a train anymore. He was trapped in a nightmarish version of reality, where nothing was as it seemed, and the dead were waiting to claim their next victim. The train was never meant to stop. Not here. Not in Frost Hollow. The last thing Martin saw before the doors slammed shut was the figure's face, pale and twisted, eyes black as night. And then everything went dark. The train never reached its final stop. Story number 4, Frozen Eyes. When Adam received the letter from the lawyer, he had to read it twice before it sank in. His father, Frank Wilkins, had left him something he hadn't even known existed. A cabin in the mountains. It was a strange inheritance, especially since Adam hadn't seen or spoken to his father in over 10 years. Their relationship had always been distant, fractured by years of bitterness and unspoken words. But now, out of nowhere, his father had left him a cabin, in a place Adam couldn't even remember. A place so remote, so isolated, that the lawyer mentioned in passing that the roads to it were often blocked by heavy snow, sometimes for weeks. Adam didn't know what to make of it, but the curiosity gnawed at him. After everything, he needed to know. So, despite his misgivings, he packed a bag and drove out to the mountains. It was midwinter when he arrived. Just before dusk, when the sun dipped behind the peaks and the cold seemed to bite a little deeper. The cabin was as lonely as he expected. A small, weather-beaten structure nestled between 2 towering pine trees, surrounded by snowdrifts that had piled high against the walls. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Adam stepped out of the car, the crunch of the snow beneath his boots the only sound. The air smelled like pine and ice, clean and sharp. He approached the cabin, his breath clouding in the cold air. The front door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dusty, dimly lit interior. It was quiet, too quiet, as though the house had been holding its breath for a long time. As he explored the place, Adam found little remnants of his father's life. Old, yellowing newspapers, half-empty whiskey bottles, an old rocking chair by the fireplace. But there was something unsettling about the place. It felt wrong, like a room full of memories that had been forgotten for a reason. That night, the wind howled outside, shaking the walls. Adam lit a fire, trying to push away the unease that had settled in his gut. He was tired, though. The drive had worn him out, and the silence in the cabin was suffocating. He climbed into the bed in the back room, pulling the thick blankets up to his chin, and closed his eyes. But sleep didn't come easy. Around midnight, he woke to a strange sound. It wasn't the wind, it was something else. A low, shuffling noise, like footsteps on the floor. Adam sat up, heart pounding in his chest. The air was cold, colder than before. He glanced around the dark room, his eyes adjusting to the low light of the dying fire. There was nothing there, just the shadows dancing on the walls. But the feeling lingered. Something was wrong. He finally fell back to sleep, only to wake again a few hours later, his body stiff and chilled. This time, he had a dream. In the dream, he was standing in the snow. The world around him was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, as though the air itself was pressing down on him. And then he saw it. His father, Frank Wilkins, lying face down in the snow. His body was frozen, still as death, his face a grotesque mask of ice. But what sent a chill through Adam's veins were his eyes. They were wide open, staring straight up at him. Pale, lifeless, but somehow full of accusation. Adam woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The room was cold again, colder than it should have been. He stood up, the wooden floor creaking beneath his weight, and walked over to the window. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, swirling in the dark, like the wind was trying to bury the world. But something else caught his eye, something he hadn't noticed before. The footprints. Outside the window, in the snow, there were fresh footprints leading toward the cabin. They were too large to be from an animal. They were human. A sickening thought crossed Adam's mind. Was someone out there? Had his father been out there too? He quickly grabbed his coat and stepped outside, the cold air cutting at his skin. The footprints led into the woods, disappearing behind a thick patch of trees. He followed them, his breath visible in the harsh light of the moon. And then he found it. A large clearing in the forest. At the center was an old stone circle, long forgotten by time. The stones were cracked and covered in moss, but as Adam approached, he noticed something even more unsettling. In the center of the circle, half buried in the snow, was an old wooden box. Adam hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity got the better of him. He dug through the snow and pulled the box free. It was heavy, damp, and worn. With trembling hands, he opened it. Inside was a collection of old photographs. Pictures of his father when he was younger, standing beside a woman Adam didn't recognize. There was a man in some of the pictures, too. His face was obscured in all but one photo, and in that one, he was grinning, but it was a cold, twisted smile. Adam's stomach churned. As he stared at the photographs, a voice echoed in his mind, distant but clear. The curse of the bloodline. It's yours now, too. The words sent a shiver down his spine. He closed the box quickly, but the images kept replaying in his mind, and with them came the dream again, his father's frozen body, eyes wide and accusing. Adam stumbled back, the realization hitting him like a blow to the chest. His father hadn't just died in a snowstorm. He had been sacrificed. there was something ancient about this place. A curse that ran deep through his bloodline. Every few generations, someone had to die to feed the curse, to keep it at bay. And now, it was Adam's turn. The wind howled through the trees, and Adam could feel the temperature dropping again, the cold seeping into his bones. He turned to run back to the cabin, but as he did, he saw something in the distance, his father's body, just like in the dream, lying in the snow with those frozen eyes staring back at him. And in the distance there was a figure standing in the snow. It was his father, or the thing that had once been his father, eyes wide and frozen, mouth open in a silent scream. And as Adam watched, the figure slowly began to move toward him, its steps slow but inevitable. The curse was alive again, and this time there would be no escape. Story number 5. Blizzard of the Forgotten. It started like any other winter storm, a little snow here and there, a bit of wind picking up. But by the time the group of strangers made it to the isolated lodge, they were already trapped. The storm hit hard, and it didn't let up. The road had been closed, the power lines snapped, and they were stuck in the middle of nowhere, with only the lodge to shelter them. The lodge was an old place, built long before any of them had ever been born. A faded sign hung outside, reading Snowfall Lodge, and there were no other buildings for miles around. It was exactly the kind of place people came to escape the world, and that's why they were all here. There was Mark, a businessman in his mid-30s, already on his phone when they arrived, trying to make sense of the situation. Then there was Claire, a young woman who looked out of place with her expensive designer clothes and flawless makeup. Her eyes were wide, anxious, as she looked out at the blizzard. Sam, an older man in his 50s, had a quiet demeanor, but his eyes darted around nervously as though he knew more than he was letting on. And there was Kelly, a college student with a backpack full of books and a sarcastic attitude, looking as though she'd rather be anywhere else. The lodge was just as they'd expected. Old wooden beams, dimly lit, with the smell of pine and dust in the air. A massive fireplace took up one wall, the flames dancing and crackling, offering the only warmth in the building. The owner, a woman named Ruth, greeted them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She showed them to their rooms, murmuring something about the storm being worse than usual this time of year. The first night passed without incident. The storm raged outside, but the fire inside kept them warm, and the guests tried to make the best of it. Mark paced the room with his phone, clearly frustrated by the lack of signal. Claire curled up with a book in the corner. Sam, who had been staring at the fireplace for a long time, finally spoke. "You ever heard of the people who disappear here during storms like this?" Kelly looked up from her phone, raising an eyebrow. "What, like ghost stories?" she asked, unimpressed. Sam nodded. "Not stories, real people, the kind that vanish without a trace." Ruth, who had been standing nearby, gave a small, nervous laugh. "It's just a myth, Sam. People get lost out in the snow, that's all." But that night, something happened that made them all question if there was more truth to it than anyone realized. Around midnight, the fire went out. The lodge was plunged into cold darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning. The wind howled against the windows, and outside, the snow piled higher and higher. Claire was the first to hear it. A soft, distant knock at the door. It wasn't a knock from outside, she could tell. It came from within the lodge, like someone was tapping on the wood. She stiffened, glancing around the room. "Did anyone hear that?" she asked, her voice quiet but shaky. Kelly rolled her eyes. Probably the wind. But Sam's face had gone pale, his eyes wide. "No, it's not the wind." He stood up slowly, his movements stiff, like he wasn't sure he should move at all. Mark stood up too, frowning. "What do you mean? We're trapped here with a blizzard outside. Of course it's the wind." But Sam didn't answer. He was already walking toward the hallway, his hand on the wall for support. Kelly shook her head, annoyed, but she followed him anyway. The others reluctantly joined. As they stepped into the hall, the temperature seemed to drop even further, the air thick with a strange, heavy feeling. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a sound that chilled them to the bone. A low, guttural whispering, as if dozens of voices were speaking in unison, but none of them could make out the words. They turned a corner and froze. At the end of the hall, there was a door that hadn't been there when they arrived. An old wooden door with peeling paint and rusty hinges. It wasn't part of the lodge they had seen earlier. The door creaked open by itself, and through the gap, they saw a room they hadn't expected. An old sitting room, worn and dim, as though it had been untouched for years. In the center, a large, ornate mirror hung on the wall, its surface cracked and scratched. Claire gasped. "What is this place?" Before anyone could answer, a figure appeared in the mirror. It wasn't one of them. It was a man, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes dark and hollow. He was staring back at them from the reflection, his mouth twitching in an unnatural way. The group recoiled in fear, but the man in the mirror didn't move. He stayed there, staring. Then the whispering started again, louder this time, filling the air. It sounded like the voices were coming from all around them, from the very walls, the floor, the ceiling. "We're not alone," Sam muttered, his voice trembling. "They're still here, the ones who disappeared." The lights flickered, and for a moment everything was bathed in shadow. When the lights came back on, the man in the mirror was gone. But the door, now wide open, led to a hallway that seemed longer than it had been before, stretching farther into the darkness of the lodge. The group hesitated but then began to move forward. They had no choice. The storm outside had grown even more violent, and they were trapped with whatever presence lingered in the lodge. They reached the door, and beyond it they found more rooms, more empty spaces where the forgotten guests had stayed. Rooms that weren't on any of the lodge's maps, rooms that hadn't existed. And in every room there were whispers, the sound of people who had never left, the spirits of those who had vanished in storms past, their faces twisted in eternal terror. They had never made it out. They were still here. The group moved together, a little closer now, as the storm raged outside. The wind screamed through the trees, but inside, the real storm was just beginning. Because the lodge wasn't just a place of shelter, it was a prison, and it was hungry. Story number 6, The Hollow Tree. On the outskirts of the small village of Eldridge, there stood an ancient tree. It was old, older than anything in the village, its gnarled branches stretching into the sky like skeletal fingers. The locals called it the Hollow Tree. Not because it had a hollow, but because there was something about it that made people feel uncomfortable. They avoided it, especially during the winter when the winds howled and the nights were long. But that didn't stop Ethan Parker. Ethan was a curious 17-year-old who had heard the rumors. The stories his grandmother told him late at night, the whispers of the old folks down at the pub, all spoke of the tree in hushed tones. They said the tree was cursed, that it had stood there for centuries, always watching, always waiting. But the most unsettling story was the one about the bodies. "Stay away from the hollow tree, Ethan," his grandmother had warned him just days before. "There's evil in it, boy. People who go near it never come back the same. Some don't come back at all." But Ethan didn't believe in curses. He didn't believe in old wives' tales or ghost stories. He was young, bold, and full of restless energy. So, one cold winter evening, when the full moon hung high in the sky and the village seemed to sleep beneath a blanket of snow, he decided to venture out. The wind was biting as he walked toward the edge of the village, the only sound his boots crunching in the deep snow. The moonlight made everything look sharp, clean, unnatural. The hollow tree stood just ahead, looming in the distance like some forgotten sentinel. Its dark trunk was wider than any tree Ethan had ever seen, and the hollow at its center seemed to stretch forever into darkness. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. He stepped forward, his feet crunching the snow louder now as he got closer. He stood before the tree. The hollow, big enough for a grown man to crawl into, yawned in front of him. The air around it felt colder, almost as if the tree itself was pulling in the heat from the world around it. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, but his feet remained planted. Then he heard it. A soft sound like a faint whisper carried on the wind. He leaned closer, straining his ears. The sound was clearer now, like the voices of children. No, not children. Whispers of something older, something sadder. Ethan's curiosity won out. He bent down and peered inside the hollow. At first, he thought it was just the shadows. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw them. Bodies, preserved by the cold, stacked in the hollow like forgotten dolls. There were dozens of them, each one frozen in unnatural positions, their eyes wide open in eternal terror. Some wore clothes from decades ago, others from centuries past. Their skin was pale, almost waxy, and their faces, twisted, frozen in expressions of horror, were all staring up at him. Ethan stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat, his heart hammered in his chest. It wasn't just the bodies, it was the eyes. Every one of them seemed to follow his movement, tracking him in the cold darkness. He backed away from the tree, his legs shaking, but the air around him felt thicker, suffocating. A voice, low and sorrowful, whispered from the darkness of the tree. It was faint at first, like a murmur from another world, but it grew louder, clearer. "You shouldn't have come." Ethan spun around, but there was no one there. He turned back toward the tree, his pulse quickening. The bodies, were they moving? He could have sworn the frozen eyes blinked, or was it just his imagination? The whispers continued. "You are marked now. You must leave before the storm comes." The wind picked up, whipping the snow around him in chaotic spirals. His feet felt heavy, as though the earth itself was trying to drag him back toward the tree. His breath came in sharp gasps as he tried to run, but something inside the tree was pulling at him, something ancient and hungry. He turned and ran as fast as he could, stumbling through the deep snow, the whispers of the tree echoing in his mind. He didn't stop until he reached his house, his chest heaving, his skin covered in cold sweat. He slammed the door behind him and locked it, his mind racing. The next few days were a blur. He couldn't stop thinking about the tree, the bodies, the whispers. But when he tried to tell anyone, they just looked at him like he was crazy. His grandmother, pale and shaking, said nothing, but he could see the fear in her eyes. "You went to the tree," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Didn't you?" Ethan nodded, unable to lie. "The tree has a hold on you now, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "The souls of those trapped in it never leave. They call to the living. They want you to join them." That night, a storm hit. Not just any storm, but one like the town had never seen. Snow poured from the sky in thick sheets, and the wind howled so fiercely that it felt like the world was being torn apart. And as the storm raged, Ethan began to hear the whispers again. Only this time, they were louder. They weren't just voices in the wind, they were coming from the very walls of his house. The sound of shuffling footsteps, faint laughter, and cries for help filled the air, as though the dead were moving, restless, waiting. Ethan didn't know how much time passed. All he knew was that he couldn't escape it. The spirits were calling him, beckoning him to the tree. He could hear their whispers in his sleep, in his waking moments everywhere. The storm grew fiercer, and the pressure in his head grew worse, as if the very air around him was thick with the weight of the past. The next morning, the storm passed. The village was covered in an eerie silence, the snow thick and heavy. Ethan didn't go to school. Instead, he stood in front of the window, staring out at the horizon. He could feel it now, the pull of the tree. He knew it wasn't over. The spirits were still there, still waiting, and they wouldn't rest until they had him, until he joined them in the hollow. He looked out at the tree in the distance, its branches bending under the weight of the snow. For the first time, Ethan understood. The hollow tree wasn't just a place, it was a trap, and he was its latest victim. Story number 7. White Noise. The storm came without warning. The weather reports had said it would be a flurry, a few inches at best. But by the time night fell, the wind howled like a wounded animal, and the snow buried everything in its path. Power lines snapped, the roads disappeared, and the small town of Old Creek was swallowed whole by the blizzard. Dan Collins had been the host of the midnight radio show for years, a small-time gig at a local, isolated station that broadcasted from an old building on the outskirts of town. He wasn't used to anything exciting happening out here, nothing more than the occasional weird call from an insomniac or a joke gone too far. It was quiet, peaceful even, just the way Dan liked it. That night, though, was different. The snowstorm raged outside, the windows of the radio station rattling with every gust of wind. Dan had gone through the usual motions, queuing up music, reading the weather report that no one was really listening to, making small talk about the storm. He thought it was funny, how everyone in town had probably tucked in early, huddled up with hot drinks and blankets, waiting for the storm to pass. But then the static began. It was barely noticeable at first, a faint buzz that echoed through the airwaves like the hum of a broken speaker. At first, Dan thought it was the storm messing with the signal. It happened sometimes. But as the minutes passed, the static grew louder. Not just in his headphones, but over the airwaves too. It crackled and screeched, almost like voices, whispering and shouting in a language he couldn't understand. "Anyone out there?" Dan asked, leaning into the microphone. "This is Court, Old Creek's only station. If you're listening, give me a call. Let me know you're hearing this." There was no answer, just more static. But then, through the noise, something else emerged. A voice, low, distorted, but unmistakably human. Dan Collins. His blood froze. It was his name. Someone on the other side of the storm was calling for him. But how? "Who's there?" Dan demanded, his fingers shaking as he adjusted the knobs, trying to clear the signal. But it didn't work. The voice grew louder, clearer. "You are not alone." Dan's heart skipped. His eyes darted to the studio's windows, but all he could see was the white blur of snow in every direction. The storm was closing in, but this was something different. "Who is this?" Dan shouted into the microphone, his voice strained, but the reply came through anyway. "We are with you. We've always been." The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and a cold wave of dread washed over him. Something wasn't right. The voice? It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a technical glitch. It was too real, too familiar. Dan's hand hovered over the broadcast equipment, but before he could react, the voice continued, clear as day. "Turn around." He froze. Slowly, he turned in his chair, expecting to see something, or someone, but there was nothing. Just the empty studio, the flashing lights of the equipment casting an eerie glow in the dark room. He checked the door. It was locked, but the voice wasn't done. It's already here. The sound of the static became deafening, almost overwhelming, as if the radio waves themselves were alive. Dan felt his pulse quicken, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the voice spoke again. "You're not safe. It's coming for you." Dan's mind raced. He scrambled to turn off the broadcast, but the buttons weren't working. The static was so loud now it felt like it was seeping into his very bones. His eyes darted around the room, but all he could see was the storm, a whirlwind of white outside the glass, obscuring everything beyond. The voice cut through the chaos again, calm and cold. "The storm has opened a door, Dan. A door that should have stayed shut. It's here, and it knows you. Knows everything about you." The air grew colder, the temperature in the room dropping rapidly. Dan's breath fogged in front of him, and he could see his own pulse throbbing in his neck. He stumbled backward, his hand gripping the desk for support, as he looked at the speakers. The voice continued. "You thought it was the storm, didn't you? The blizzard. But it's not. It's us, and we're waiting." Dan's eyes widened in horror as he heard a faint scratching sound coming from the walls, as though something was clawing its way through the storm. He grabbed the microphone again, desperate to regain control. "Stop! Who are you? What do you want?" The response came, not through the speakers, but from the storm outside. The wind was howling, but in the howls Dan could hear something else. Something closer. There were voices, low and guttural, like whispers from the depths of the earth. "I want you to listen, Dan. We're in the storm. We've always been here. And now that the door is open, you can't escape." With a final, shuddering crackle of static, the voice disappeared. Dan was left alone in the studio, the room silent except for the relentless roar of the blizzard outside. But it wasn't over. He looked at the broadcast equipment in front of him, and the realization hit him. The storm, the voice, wasn't a coincidence. The blizzard had done something. It had opened a doorway, a crack between worlds, and the entity behind the voice was using the radio waves to reach through. The storm wasn't just a weather event, it was a conduit, a means for something trapped in the blizzard to cross over. Dan was no longer just a host. He was part of it now. The radio waves had infected him, and as the storm raged on outside, he could feel the presence in the air, something dark, something that had been waiting. And he was never going to be alone again. The snowstorm outside intensified, the lights in the station flickering, and somewhere deep in the static, the voice returned. "Dan, you're not alone." And it was only the beginning. Story number 8, The Haunting of Coldbrook Manor. The first time the Frost family saw Coldbrook Manor, they were captivated. It wasn't just the house that drew them in, it was the setting. Tucked away in the remote hills, miles from the nearest town, Coldbrook sat like an old sentinel guarding the edge of the world. Covered in snow for most of the year, the house seemed like it had come straight out of a dream, or a nightmare, depending on how you looked at it. It was an old estate, grand and imposing, with stone walls that had weathered hundreds of winters. The windows were dark, but the structure stood strong, its bones unyielding, like something that refused to die. The Frost family, Ben, his wife Evelyn, and their 2 children, Claire and Max, had been looking for a fresh start, and the manor, with its spacious rooms and sweeping views of the surrounding hills, seemed like the perfect place to begin again. The price was right too. Too right. No one could understand why a house like Coldbrook had been sitting abandoned for so long, not in such a picturesque setting. The estate agent had said very little, only that the place had been unoccupied for years and that the owners had mysteriously vanished, leaving behind nothing but the house and the overgrown grounds. But that didn't matter to Ben and Evelyn. They were tired of the city, tired of the noise, the hustle, and the constant pressure. They needed peace, and Coldbrook offered that in spades. They moved in during early December, just as the first heavy snowfall of the season began to fall. The children were excited, running through the halls, exploring rooms that hadn't seen life in years. The place was huge, with winding staircases, creaking floors, and fireplaces that hadn't been used in decades. It was perfect. At first, everything seemed fine. The house was cold, but that was expected. The heating system wasn't the best, and Ben had planned to get it fixed. The isolation of the manor, however, was something they hadn't anticipated. The snow was so thick, it was like the world outside had disappeared. No phone signal, no television, just endless white hills. The closest town was miles away, and the roads were already becoming impassable. But it was the nights that began to unsettle them. The first night, they heard it. Footsteps. Slow, measured steps in the snow outside the house. At first, Ben thought it was the wind, or perhaps an animal. But when he went to the window, he saw nothing, just the blanket of snow covering the ground, pristine and untouched. The next night, the sound came again. And again, there was nothing outside when Ben checked. He chalked it up to his imagination, the isolation getting to him. But Evelyn, ever the skeptic, wasn't so sure. "Ben, I'm telling you," she said one night, after they'd heard the footsteps once more. "There's something out there. I can feel it." Ben laughed it off, but deep down, a seed of unease began to take root in his mind. It was the same uneasy feeling he had when they first walked into the house, like something was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. As winter set in, the footsteps continued, growing more frequent, more persistent. Every night, around the same time, they would hear the crunch of snow outside their windows. The children were frightened, and Claire, the oldest, started having trouble sleeping. She spoke of dark shadows lurking outside the windows, figures she couldn't quite make out. Max, ever the brave one, said he saw a figure standing near the old stone wall that separated the manor from the woods, watching the house. Ben decided to investigate, but every time he stepped outside, there was nothing there. No footprints, no signs of anyone or anything. But the house felt different. It felt like it was pressing in on them, like it was alive in some way, and it wasn't happy they were there. The nights became harder to endure. The temperature inside the manor dropped, even with the fireplace roaring. The walls groaned under the weight of the storm, and strange sounds began to fill the house. Whispers, creaks, and a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from deep within the walls. One evening, after another long, restless night, Ben decided to search the manor. He went into the attic, a place they hadn't explored since they moved in. There, beneath a pile of old trunks and forgotten furniture, he found something. A journal. It was old, the pages yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was still legible. It belonged to the last owner of Coldbrook Manor, a man named Albert Coldbrook, who had lived there with his wife and children during the early 1800s. The journal told a chilling story. Albert Coldbrook spoke of a great snowstorm, a storm so fierce it had buried the estate under 10 feet of snow. But that wasn't the worst of it. The storm had brought something with it, something ancient, something that fed on the cold and the darkness. Albert spoke of a curse that had been placed on the manor centuries before, a curse that was tied to the land and the very storm that had buried the estate. The entity, Albert wrote, had taken his family, one by one, dragging them into the snow and freezing them alive. He spoke of footsteps in the snow that weren't his, of voices calling out in the blizzard, and of a figure that would appear in the storm, a figure that was once human but had become something much darker. The last entry was unfinished, the ink smudged and smeared as though Albert had been interrupted. There was no mention of what happened to him or his family after that. The journal simply stopped, and Ben could feel his heart pounding as he read the last lines. "It is coming for us, and there is nothing I can do to stop it. The storm is its prison, but it is waking, and it is hungry." Ben dropped the journal, his breath shallow, his mind racing. He didn't want to believe it, but everything was starting to make sense. The footsteps, the shadows, the cold that never seemed to leave the house. It was all tied to the entity, the spirit that had claimed Coldbrook Manor long ago. That night, as the wind screamed outside, the footsteps returned. But this time, they weren't just outside. They were in the house, echoing down the hall, slow and deliberate. Ben bolted upright in bed, his heart racing. He could hear the whispers now, soft and sinister, weaving through the darkness. Evelyn was awake beside him, her face pale with fear. "Ben, I can feel it. It's here." And then, the door to their room creaked open. Something stepped inside, something cold and dark, its presence filling the room like a storm cloud. A figure, tall and shadowy, stood in the doorway, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The Frost family would never leave Coldbrook Manor. The storm buried them under its weight, and the entity claimed them, just as it had claimed Albert Coldbrook and his family centuries before. The manor was theirs now, and the footsteps would never stop. Story number 9. Whispers in the Ice. James Holloway had lived in the small snowbound town of Frostfield for as long as he could remember. The town was a forgotten place, tucked away in the mountains, where the winters were long and brutal and the people were few. James wasn't bothered by the isolation. In fact, he preferred it. The only company he had now was the silence of the snow and the ghosts of his past. His house, an old wooden cabin on the edge of town, sat just by the river. The river was frozen solid during the winter, its surface covered in a thick sheet of ice, as though nature itself had sealed off the memories that lay beneath. James had lived there for over 30 years, ever since his wife, Sarah, had passed away. His children had grown up and moved away, and now it was just him. The house creaked in the wind, and the only sounds were the occasional crack of ice, the whistle of the wind through the trees, or the soft thump of snow falling from the roof. But this winter, something was different. James had been hearing things. It started subtly at first, soft, barely noticeable. Whispers, not loud enough to be words, but a murmur carried on the wind. He dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the wind or perhaps the creaking of the trees. But as the days wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from the river behind his house, where the ice stretched far out into the distance, gleaming under the pale winter sun. He tried to ignore it. He really did. But every night as the storm raged outside, the whispers became clearer. It was almost as if they were calling to him, urging him to listen. They weren't just random murmurs. There was something familiar about them. A voice that sounded almost like Sarah's, the voice he hadn't heard in over a decade. One night, unable to resist the pull any longer, James grabbed his coat and walked out into the snow, toward the river. The wind stung his face, and the world around him seemed to close in, the snow thickening until it was hard to see anything beyond the barest outline of the trees. The river, frozen as it was, looked almost peaceful, but there was something unsettling about it tonight. Something alive beneath the ice. The whispers were louder now, swirling around him, carried by the wind, but when he stepped closer to the ice, they stopped. Silence. James crouched down and placed his hand gently on the surface. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and he could feel something in the air, a heavy, oppressive feeling. He looked down, his eyes scanning the ice. There was nothing to see, just the snowflakes drifting gently across the frozen river. But his mind kept telling him that something was beneath the surface, waiting. That's when he saw it. A faint shadow moving under the ice. It was as though something, or someone, was trapped there. The figure shifted slowly, and for a brief moment, James thought he saw the face of a woman, her features distorted by the ice, her eyes wide in terror. He jerked back, his heart hammering in his chest. His breath came in sharp, visible gasps. He couldn't stop himself. He knew what he had to do. The next day, despite the snowstorm that raged outside, James made his way to the town library, a small, musty building that hadn't seen many visitors in years. The librarian, an old woman named Mrs. Barker, gave him a curious look when he asked about the history of the river. "Why do you want to know about that?" she asked, eyeing him suspiciously. "The river," James said, his voice shaking slightly. "There's something wrong with it. I've been hearing voices, whispers, from the ice." Mrs. Barker looked at him for a long time, her eyes narrowing. Then, slowly, she walked to the back of the library and returned with a thick, yellowed book. She set it on the counter in front of him. "This is the history of Frostfield," she said, her voice low, almost whispering. "And the river. You might not like what you find inside." James didn't care. He opened the book and began reading, his eyes scanning the pages. It didn't take long before he found what he was looking for. The river had claimed lives in the past. Many lives. Long ago, before the town had been settled, the river was a place of tragedy. A flood had swept through the area, drowning several people. But there was more to it. The flood wasn't just a natural disaster. It was part of a curse, one that had been placed on the land long before the town was founded. The people who had drowned had never truly left. Their spirits had been trapped beneath the river's icy surface, waiting for someone to hear their cries. And then, there it was. The final, chilling detail. James's great-grandfather, Samuel Holloway, had been one of those lost to the river. He had drowned in the flood, but it wasn't an accident. Samuel had been a part of the tragedy. He had been the one who had pushed others into the water, leading them to their deaths, and in doing so, he had brought the curse upon his family. James's own bloodline was tied to the deaths of those people. The voices from the river were not just echoes from the past, they were his family's victims, calling for justice. And the entity beneath the ice, the one that had been waiting all these years, had now turned its attention to James. He had unwittingly become part of the curse. The whispers were growing louder now, no longer just in his mind, but in the very walls of his house, in the wind, in the snow. Every night he heard them, and each time they grew closer. The figure he had seen beneath the ice was no longer just a shadow, it was real. James knew what he had to do, but it was too late. The river had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before. As the winter raged on, the whispers grew deafening, filling his ears, his mind, until there was nothing left of James Holloway but a shadow in the ice. And when the ice finally cracked, there would be no one left to hear the whispers anymore. The river had claimed them all. Story number 10. The Midnight Blizzard. It started as a weekend escape, a chance to get out of the city and away from the noise. A group of 5 friends, all in their 20s, decided to go camping in the woods north of town. They had planned for weeks, carefully picking a spot near a lake where they could hike, set up camp, and get a break from their everyday lives. None of them expected anything to go wrong. It was supposed to be fun. Just some time to relax, tell stories, and drink beer around a campfire. But nothing in the woods is ever as innocent as it seems. They arrived on Friday evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The air was cold, crisp with the promise of winter, but the forecast had been clear. No snow, no storms, just cold weather. They set up their tents, laughing and joking as they worked, the familiar sounds of friendship filling the quiet of the woods. By the time the fire was blazing, they had all settled in and started their first round of drinks. There was Sarah, the practical one who kept the group in check. James, her boyfriend, always the joker, who tried to make everyone laugh. Megan, Sarah's childhood friend, who always had a sharp sense of humor and a way of getting into trouble. Ben, the quiet one, who preferred to stay out of the spotlight but was always there when someone needed him. And Luke, the adventurous one who had pushed for the trip in the first place, claiming it would be the best way to break from their busy lives. The fire crackled and popped, and as the night went on, the temperatures dropped. A cold wind picked up, swirling through the trees, but none of them thought much of it. They roasted marshmallows, shared ghost stories, and teased each other like old friends do. But around midnight, things started to change. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, turned into something more forceful, unnatural. It howled, picking up the dry leaves and whipping them around like they were nothing. The temperature dropped even further, and the fire seemed to flicker weaker, as if something was pushing against it. Sarah stood up and wrapped her coat tighter around her. "Is it just me, or is the storm getting worse?" she asked. Luke looked up at the sky. "It's just wind, nothing to worry about." But even he seemed uneasy, staring into the dark beyond the light of the fire. They all shrugged it off and decided to call it a night. The tents were set up in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. They all zipped into their sleeping bags, trying to block out the growing howl of the wind. But sleep didn't come easy. The storm outside grew fiercer, the sound of the wind making it hard to hear anything else. But around 3 a.m., something else woke Ben. It wasn't the wind or the cold. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. He lay perfectly still, listening, heart racing. The footsteps weren't from any of his friends. They were too slow, too deliberate. Someone, or something, was out there, moving between the tents. He tried to call out, but his voice caught in his throat. The footsteps stopped. Ben held his breath, hoping it was just the wind, but the silence that followed felt wrong, unnatural. The sound of the storm outside seemed muffled, as if the woods had swallowed it whole. Then, a voice, soft, distant, almost a whisper, sounded from outside his tent. It was a voice he didn't recognize. "You're not alone." Ben's blood ran cold. He grabbed for his flashlight, but before he could move, a scream pierced the silence. "Megan." The others rushed out of their tents, the chaos of stumbling in the snow, but they were too late. By the time they reached Megan's tent, she was gone. There was no sign of her except for a faint trail of bloody footprints leading off into the woods. The group was in shock. They called out for her, but the only response was the growing wind. The storm had turned into a full-blown blizzard, snow falling in thick sheets, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of them. They huddled together, trying to stay close, trying to figure out what had happened. "Who could have done this?" James asked, his voice shaking. "We need to find her," Sarah insisted, her face pale. "We need to get out of here." But as they started to head toward the edge of the woods, the storm seemed to grow even stronger. The snow, now so thick they could barely see, cut into their skin like tiny needles. And that's when they heard it. Footsteps. But they weren't alone. The snow was thick, but they could hear someone, or something, walking behind them, keeping just out of reach, never stepping into view. Luke stopped, his eyes wide with fear. "We're not alone," he whispered, barely able to breathe. "Stop talking like that," Ben snapped, trying to force calm into his voice, but even he knew they were being stalked, hunted by something that wasn't human. One by one, they began to disappear. The snow covered their tracks, but the footprints, the bloody footprints, remained. By the time the storm passed, only Sarah and James were left. The others had vanished without a trace, their screams lost in the howling wind. The storm was finally subsiding, but the silence that followed was even worse. As the sun began to rise, Sarah and James found themselves standing at the edge of the woods, the snow around them undisturbed. There was no sign of their friends, no trace of what had happened. It was as if they had never been there at all. They turned to head back to the camp, but before they could take a step, they saw it. A figure standing in the distance, watching them. It was tall, cloaked in the snowstorm, and though it had no face, they could feel its presence, its hunger. It had been waiting for them, waiting for the storm to open the door to something ancient and dark. As Sarah and James looked at each other, they knew. Whatever it wasn't done with them. It was still hunting them, and they would never leave these woods alive. The snowstorm had awakened something far older than the storm itself, and it had claimed them all.